A New York jury just delivered a bombshell ruling, ordering disgraced Hollywood filmmaker James Toback to pay a staggering $1.6 billion to 40 women who accused him of sexual assault spanning decades. The verdict follows explosive allegations of assault, coercion, and threats, with victims describing assaults in hotel rooms, the Harvard Club, and even in his mother's apartment. I'm going to break down the verdict and the explicit details inside this horrifying lawsuit. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. In an absolutely historic ruling out of New York, filmmaker James Toback has been ordered to pay a staggering $1.6 billion in damages after all of these allegations of sexual assault. The verdict, which came down on April 9th in New York Supreme Court, marks a monumental victory for 40 women who accused the now 80-year-old director of sexual misconduct dating as far back as the 1970s. And it is a case that attorneys believe might just be the largest sexual assault civil verdict in New York State history. Now, following this significant legal victory, attorney Brad Beckworth, who's representing the accusers, said in a statement to the media, quote, "The jury's verdict is about justice, but more important, it's about taking power back from the abusers and their enablers and returning it to those they tried to control. For the women who endured years of silence, this verdict for them was transformative." The lead plaintiff in this case, Mary Monahan, told Variety in an emotional statement, "For decades I carried this trauma in silence, and today a jury believed me, believed us. That changes everything. This verdict is more than a number. It's a declaration. We are not disposable. We are not liars. We are not collateral damage in someone else's power trip." Now, before we get into the horrifying allegations in the lawsuit, if you're not familiar with who James Toback is, he is the screenwriter behind films like Bugsy and Two Girls and a Guy, and was one of the first major Hollywood figures that was exposed during the Me Too movement nearly a decade ago. It was part of an expose that was published in the Los Angeles Times. Now, interestingly, despite his firm denial of any wrongdoing, he didn't really offer any kind of defense against the civil action, at least as of late, and he didn't seem to even hire an attorney. He also has not yet commented publicly on the verdict. So in the past, high-profile actresses like Rachel McAdams, Selma Blair, Juliana Moore previously accused Toback of on-set harassment, including demanding nudity during auditions, masturbating in front of them, and threatening retaliation if they spoke out. Selma Blair even told Vanity Fair back in 2017, when he called these women liars and said he didn't recall meeting them, "I just felt rage." Hey, I want to quickly thank Upside for sponsoring today's Law&Crime YouTube takeover. Now, Upside is a free app that gives you real cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, restaurants. It is super easy to use. You just claim an offer in the app, you pay as usual using your card, you get paid. And this is actual real cash back. You can use Upside at places like Shell, Exxon, 7-Eleven, Chipotle, just to name a few. So to find out how much you can earn, you click the link in the description to download Upside, or you scan the QR code on screen. And make sure to use our promo code LCTakeover, and you'll get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Now, back to this lawsuit. It was filed under New York's Adult Survivors Act and consolidated claims from over a dozen named plaintiffs and several anonymous women. The filing alleges that, quote, "For at least 4 decades, James Toback used his reputation, power, and influence in the entertainment industry, including as an award-winning movie director, screenwriter, and member of the prestigious Harvard Club of New York City, to lure young women, including plaintiffs, through fraud, coercion, force, and intimidation into compromising situations where he falsely imprisoned, sexually abused, assaulted, and/or battered them." And many of the accusers that brought these claims are now in their 30s and 40s. And we've talked about the statute of limitations when we get into lawsuits involving sexual assault claims. These victims were able to make their claims thanks to the Adult Survivors Act. So this created a 1-year look-back window that opened in 2022, allowing survivors to bypass that statute of limitations. And just to kind of give you a little more insight into this, on May 24th of 2022, New York Governor Kathy Hochul signed the Adult Survivors Act into law, and it ran from November of 2022 until the following November of 2023, meaning anyone over the age of 18 could file a claim regardless of when the abuse happened, so long as they filed it within this window. And due to the new legislation, survivors now have a 20-year window to file if the assault occurred after 2019, but only 1 year if it happened before 2019. And the New York Times reports that over 3,000 lawsuits were filed while this window remained active, including one infamous lawsuit that we've talked about a whole lot here on Sidebar, and that's the one that was filed against Sean Diddy Combs by his ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura. So this lawsuit against Toback also implicated the Harvard Club of New York, where Toback, an Ivy League alumnus, was a frequent patron. Attorneys allege that he used the club as a sort of hunting ground, luring victims there for meals and drinks before assaulting them. And shockingly, they claimed the club knew he was exploiting their space for basically being a predator, yet turned a blind eye, allegedly prioritizing his prestige over women's safety. And the Harvard Club was actually named as a defendant as part of this initial filing, but was later dropped from the case, according to reporting from the New York Times. So this lawsuit claimed that the club allowed Toback unchecked access for decades, only expelling him in 2017 after the Los Angeles Times exposed him. But by then, the damage was done. Plaintiffs described assaults in the club's dining rooms, bathrooms, stairwells, hotel rooms, with some incidents dating back to 1989. And the lawsuit points to one specific article that was published that year containing allegations of misconduct against Toback. The lawsuit reads, in March 1989, Spy magazine published an article titled The Pickup Artist's Guide to Picking Up Women, a case-by-case look at movie director James Toback's street technique. In the article, two women who defendant Toback had victimized laid out 13 separate accounts of Toback's predatory behavior and sexual assaults. And then there is a whole list of categories in Toback's alleged scheme. Toback reportedly responded to a request for comment on the piece, and this is what he allegedly told the reporter for Spy, quote, "I hope you know what you're doing when you F with me." He went on grimly, "If you print this piece, I promise it will be the single thing you regret most in your life." When pressed for details, he said, "Think of your very worst nightmare." Dramatic pause. "It'll be worse than that." Now, according to court filings that we obtained, Toback employed a systemic grooming tactic that dozens of women reported experiencing over decades. That alleged pattern breaks down into 6 distinct stages: approaching these women, establishing an introduction, building trust and credibility, grooming and isolating them before escalating requests into sexual demands, sexually assaulting them, and finally threatening them into remaining silent. And we're going to examine each stage as detailed in the lawsuit, revealing what plaintiffs describe as Mr. Toback's decades-long cycle of abuse. So let's start with stage 1, the approach. So the filing alleges that Toback targeted women in high-traffic New York City areas, particularly the Upper West Side, Midtown Manhattan subways, and Grand Central Station. Plaintiffs claim that he would actually cold approach strangers, lure them in by telling them in various ways that he was this high-profile director and that these women were exactly what he was looking for. The filing states, quote, defendant Toback would approach unsuspecting women on the streets of New York City under the pretext of discussing potential acting roles in his movies. He would often introduce himself, stating something similar to, "My name's James Toback, I'm a movie director." For example, Toback approached Jane Doe 20 on the street and admitted he had been following her for several blocks. He explained who he was and described himself to Jane Doe 20 as a pickup artist that spotted women and talent on the street. And by the way, this goes way beyond Jane Doe 20. Lead plaintiff Mary Monahan explained how she met James Toback on a street back in 1998. She says he lured her to meet at his editing suite for a film called Love in Paris. Another plaintiff, Sheila Hagman, said that Toback approached her at Grand Central Terminal and said she was, quote, perfect to be the star of his next movie. Another woman, Brandy Ishkovich, said that Toback reveled in her by telling her she looked like Molly Ringwald. Plaintiff Frances Wilson claimed she was inside a taxi cab when Toback shouted at her she was, quote, exactly who he'd been looking for. So why did this work so well? The thing is, Toback was already a known Oscar-nominated filmmaker, so these women didn't really have a reason to doubt his intentions, and so these initial approaches seemed legitimate. So with that, now we're moving into the next stage, stage 2, in Toback's alleged playbook, building trust and credibility. So after his initial approach in public, Toback needed to make the unbelievable believable, and this is where Toback used his credentials and prior film experience essentially to convince these women he was who he was claiming to be, or at least he was approaching them for the reason he was approaching them, this powerful director that could make or break careers. But the lawsuit makes it clear this wasn't about turning any of these chance meetings into something legitimate. It was textbook predatory behavior designed to create false trust and lower defenses. Toback's approach in this phase involved showcasing evidence of his industry stature, and this was done in a variety of ways, including presenting items such as DVDs of his films or his Directors Guild of America membership card. According to the filing, defendant Toback carried with him various credentials, including magazines with his picture or his Directors Guild of America identification card to gain women's trust. For instance, one woman, Nicole Hodges, claimed she was initially skeptical when meeting him initially, but, quote, defendant Toback overcame plaintiff Nicole Hodges' skepticism by pulling out 3 DVDs of his own films that he happened to be carrying. Plaintiff Christine Hudman says she met him at a bagel shop in 1992 when she was just 21 years old, and after he gave her a note claiming to be a director and she refused coffee, she later bumped into him again and agreed to meet at his apartment. According to the filing, when Christine arrived at defendant Toback's apartment building, Toback was at a table in the lobby reading an article about himself. He frequently mentioned the names of A-list movie stars during the conversation and then told Christine he could write a part for her in his next film. When Christine asked Toback why he would write a part for her without having seen her act, he said it was because he could. Plaintiff Brandy Ishkovitz, who says she met Toback in the late 1980s when she was 18 or 19, described her experience with Toback, who she says similarly tossed around his past film experience to grab her attention. Quote, defendant Toback approached Brandy while she was walking down the street. He introduced himself and mentioned he was the director of the film The Pickup Artist, starring Molly Ringwald and Robert Downey Jr. Toback commented that Brandy looked like Molly Ringwald, and under the guise of an audition and discussing a professional opportunity, Toback set up a meeting with Brandy. And here's the thing, these tactics, they worked. The women believed they were dealing with a real-time director who could help their careers, making them vulnerable to the next stage. Private grooming of these women and coercing them into doing sexual favors for him under the guise of auditions or professional discussions. It's like a textbook situation, the casting couch situation, right? So now we reach stage 3. So this is where he lured women into private, isolated settings while pretending to audition them for his films. And Toback frequently arranged meetings in environments that appeared legitimate but were in fact designed for privacy and dominance. At the Harvard Club of New York City, this allegedly included private dining rooms, stairwells, restrooms, private hotel rooms. Multiple plaintiffs claimed they were assaulted there, including Jolene Hayes, Nicole Hodges, and Jane Doe's 4, 15, 16, and 21. His apartment was another trap. He billed it as a screening room or office, leaving women unaware that they were entering his private residence until it was too late, when the disturbing reality of these meetings surfaced. These meetings began with conversations that were deeply violating. According to the lawsuit, at these meetings, the conversation rarely involved business. Instead, defendant Toback would boast about his alleged sexual conquests and ask humiliating personal questions of the women, including plaintiffs. For example, Toback asked Jane Doe 20 questions about her pubic hair, orgasms, and sexual preferences, and he asked Jane Doe 8 whether she masturbated. While eating lunch with Jane Doe 15, Toback described his past sexual experiences in detail and told her that he would want her to be sexually involved with him if he were to cast her in his film. Defendant Toback also claimed that he fathered many children, telling plaintiff Mary Monahan that he fathered as many as 99 children. Similarly, Toback told Jane Doe 4 he had fathered over 75 children. But this is still only the beginning, because what came next is where the reality of this case takes a deeply disturbing turn, because now we enter the second half of stage 3 in Toback's alleged pattern, coercion into sexual behavior, which then bleeds directly into stage 4, assault. After Toback grabbed women's attention on the street and then built up his reputation with press clippings, DVDs, stories about celebrities, the lawsuit claims that the next move in his script was to isolate them and reframe sexual boundaries as part of the acting process. Sexual behavior, he insisted, was a trust exercise, a way to show artistic vulnerability and a necessary audition to prove comfort with expressing themselves sexually. Plaintiff Osa Wallander, who says she met Toback back in 1995 when she was about 21 or 22 years old, had lunch with him a few times to discuss a potential role. Eventually, he invited her to a hotel room to, quote, watch some of his work and prepare for what he described as a screen test. Toback asked if she was comfortable with nudity for the role. She said she was, but what followed had nothing to do with acting. The filing reads, Osa said she would not have a problem with the nudity the role required, but Toback asked her to prove it by taking her shirt off. Osa did so. Then, Toback told Osa to sit down. He kneeled in front of her and began rubbing his genitals against her leg. He instructed Osa to look into his eyes and squeeze his nipples while he humped her leg. And we're not going to get into the rest of this because it is just incredibly graphic, but let's just say he finished this experience with her by forcing private parts of his body onto her, leaving Osa to quickly get dressed and leave. Then we have plaintiff Lee Eck, who says she met Toback when she was around 24 back in July of 2005. She was invited to his apartment under the guise of a professional opportunity where Toback even showed Lee a documentary about his own career. But then the conversation took a disturbing turn. She claims he began to share his philosophy on sex and framed this as if it was something he would discuss normally with A-list actors. According to the filing, quote, defendant Toback requested Lee prove herself sexually to him in various ways, including masturbating in front of him, letting him touch her genitals, getting naked, or taking a shower while he watched. Lee declined, though terrified at the thought of disappointing or angering Toback. But Toback was relentless in pursuing Lee, belittling and demeaning her and accusing her of being selfish, prudish, and too timid to be successful in the entertainment industry. And the filing claims he then made another sexual suggestion and began to assault her by, and this is how it's worded in the filing, humping her leg. Plaintiff Adrienne Lavallee, who claims she was around 24 when she met Toback back in 2006, claims that Toback approached her initially at, of all places, a CVS store before the two met up twice afterwards to discuss what Toback claimed was a film role. When he took her to a hotel to audition, however, that is when things apparently spiraled. The filing reads, at the hotel, defendant Toback asked Adrienne to remove her clothes so he could see her body. Adrienne refused, and Toback began berating her, alleging she was not serious about acting. Adrienne succumbed to the pressure and removed her clothes. Defendant Toback approached her and pressed his crotch on her leg. And just like with the others, she claims he assaulted her. But Adrienne's story didn't stop there, because Toback allegedly told her he couldn't cast her in a sexual role unless he first heard how she performed sexually. He claimed an A-list actress had done something similar for him, and then went further. He performed a sexual act on Adrienne so he could, quote, see how she would be in that kind of scene. Other prompts he assigned to these women, including Mary Monahan's account of what she called trust exercises, an account from a Jane Doe who says she was explicitly asked what she would do if she was alone in a room with male genitalia. So let's start with Monahan, who says she met Toback when she was around 28 years old in the late 1990s. After arriving at his editing suite for a meeting and audition for his film, Love in Paris, she claims he asked her to participate in these so-called trust exercises. The filing reads, Toback asked her to participate in a trust exercise by getting completely naked and then speaking to Toback. Defendant Toback told Mary that several other famous actresses auditioned for him in the nude. Mary disrobed while Toback remained fully clothed. After speaking for about 45 minutes, Toback told Mary to come over to the couch where he was sitting. As she sat down, he moved to the floor and straddled her leg. He then proceeded to assault her and then told her he'd cast her in this film. That's what the allegation is. As for Jane Doe number 4, the claim there is that Toback told her she was special, that he wanted to write a script just for her, took her to the Harvard Club where he brought her to a private room and allegedly gave her a very bizarre prompt to do. According to the filing, he took Jane Doe 4 upstairs to a room for some role play. The prompt Toback gave Jane Doe 4 was to imagine she was alone in the room with a male genitalia and tell him what she would do to it. After the role play, Toback interviewed Jane Doe 4 about her sexual history, requesting details about each person with whom Jane Doe 4 had been intimate. He then pressured her into performing sexual acts for him, which she refused, before he then, in a similar fashion, assaulted her. But get this, Jane Doe 4 met up again with Toback, this time, of all places, at his mother's apartment. The filing reads, in or about December 2008, Jane Doe 4 met with defendant Toback at his deceased mother's apartment, The Majestic. After conversations and many stories from Toback describing his famous connections, Toback asked Jane Doe 4 if she trusted him. Jane Doe 4 stated she did not, and Toback became angry. He said he couldn't work with someone who didn't trust him. Toback then forced Jane Doe 4 to repeat the act from their last meeting, telling Jane Doe 4 to stretch her leg out. Following the alleged assault, she says he later sent her sexually explicit text messages, and this pattern repeated in 2013 when she says she saw him again nearly 5 years later. Plaintiff Jane Doe 5 says she met Toback after he approached her on the street, telling her he had a film called Black and White that was in theaters at the time. Later, she claims he took her to an apartment, told her they would have to really know each other, and began speaking about how actors needed to have a special relationship to be convincing on camera, and also gave her a sexual prompt. According to the filing, quote, Toback then asked Jane Doe to do something that felt sexual but also brave at the same time. Toback waited in the bedroom and told her to walk in when she was ready. In response to his prompt, Jane Doe 5 decided to take off her clothes and walk into the room and sing. When she walked in, Toback was lying on the bed. Defendant reached out to Jane Doe 5 and blocked the door. He told her she could not leave and to sit down. So essentially, she was trapped, and what followed, she claims, was an assault. And then we arrive at stage 6, the aftermath. This is where James Toback's pattern of abuse shifted from physical assault to intimidation and threats. And after the alleged assaults, the plaintiffs say he deployed a strategy designed to silence his victims and shield himself from consequences. So first, the suit claims that Toback made explicit threats to ruin careers and told victims in no uncertain terms that speaking out meant a professional death sentence. According to the filing, after he assaulted them, defendant Toback would harass, threaten, extort, and mislead women, including plaintiffs, in order to hinder and prevent their disclosure of his sexual abuse and avoid prosecution for his abuse. Toback would often threaten his victims, including plaintiffs, that if they ever told anyone about the assaults, he would ruin their career. For example, when Toback finished assaulting Jane Doe 5, he told her she could never say anything to anyone ever, or she would never have a career in Hollywood and or acting. But Toback didn't stop at career threats, according to this lawsuit. Now, the plaintiffs argued that he escalated to terrifying suggestions of violence, claiming connections to organized crime and even confessing to murders, real or imagined, in graphic detail. According to the lawsuit, Toback was, quote, telling them that he had ties to the mob and knew people who hurt people. For example, plaintiff Marion Hedinger was too afraid to tell anyone about Toback assaulting her because Toback had told her he had killed a man in graphic detail and that he had ties to the mob. And just to give you a few other examples, quote, Toback told Jane Doe 18 that he had killed a therapist at Harvard by bashing her head against a radiator. He bragged to Jane Doe 8 that he had killed someone with a fork and that his typist had been murdered. And just to be clear about something, while it's alleged he said he did these things, he's never been arrested or charged in connection with any killing. And by the way, with respect to any of these claims of sexual assault, just to be clear about that. But these statements, the plaintiffs allege, were meant to terrify and force them into silence. But instead, they chose to speak up. And now, after years of litigating this case in New York Supreme Court, a Manhattan jury reached a historic verdict, bringing long-awaited justice to these victims. So how did we get here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this all began with a civil lawsuit filed in 2022 under New York's Adult Survivors Act. And initially, 45 women were listed as plaintiffs. 5 later withdrew, so it left 40 women who moved forward with their claims. And as this case approached trial, James Toback actually represented himself, even deposing his own alleged victims. But he later claimed in court documents that his health issues prevented him from participating any further. He tried to get the trial delayed due to these issues, but to no avail. And he wrote in a June 2024 filing, "The effort to move this case forward, despite my inability to appear to defend myself, flouts any common understanding of fairness." And so in January, after he failed to appear for an in-person conference scheduled for the 23rd, Judge Adam Silvera entered a default judgment against him, meaning he lost. He automatically loses this lawsuit. So a week-long trial on damages alone was held this past week instead. Very similar to what happened in the Alex Jones case. It's not a question of liability, it becomes a question of what are the damages, what is the punishment? And a week-long trial on damages alone was held this past week. And it was at the conclusion of this trial that the jury decided on $280 million in compensatory damages and a staggering $1.4 billion in punitive damages awarded based on a finding that Toback's conduct was, quote, wanton, reckless, or malicious. So what comes next? Well, with the nearly $1.7 billion judgment, Toback faces one of the largest financial penalties ever imposed in a sexual assault case. According to the New York Times, he has previously described himself as financially destitute, so it remains unclear how much he can actually pay. But the ruling, nonetheless, sends an unmistakable message that decades of perceived impunity can still meet accountability. For survivors like Ms. Monahan, the verdict, truly a long-awaited vindication. As she told USA Today, quote, "The world knows now what we've always known. What he did was real. And what we did, standing up, speaking out, was right." And for the legal team, this victory is not just a reckoning for Toback, but it says something larger. It says something about the industry, the culture that allegedly enabled him for far too long. Brad Beckworth, the attorney representing the plaintiffs in this case, told the media, quote, "Several years ago, when the Me Too movement began, I think many of us thought that we were past the point where men in positions of power would prey on women. We now know that the movement didn't go far enough. We still have a lot of people in this country who abuse their power, and there are many more who turn a blind eye to it." That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.